The airport buzzed with the usual chaos. Announcements crackling over the intercom, hurried footsteps, and the clatter of luggage wheels on tiled floors. Sophie adjusted the strap of her worn messenger bag, her eyes scanning the baggage carousel with a mix of exhaustion and relief. After a long flight back from visiting her sister abroad, she was eager to get home, crash on her bed, and forget about the world for a few hours. Her attention snapped to a suitcase tumbling onto the conveyor belt. Black, scuffed, with a bright yellow tag. "That's mine," she thought. Without hesitation, she reached for it, barely noticing the man standing a few feet away, who was reaching for the exact same bag. Their hands brushed for a brief moment, and Sophie let out an awkward laugh. "Oh, sorry, this one's mine," she said, gripping the handle firmly. The man, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, paused, his sharp features softening as he glanced down at the bag. "Actually, I think it's mine," he said, his voice calm but confident. Sophie frowned and checked the yellow tag. No name, just a random barcode. She held it up. "No name on this, so how are you sure?" He shrugged, a small amused smile tugging at his lips. "I packed it. Trust me." Sophie tilted her head, refusing to let go. "Funny, I thought I packed this too." He chuckled softly, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. "Look, why don't we open it and find out? If it's yours, I'll apologize and carry it for you as a peace offering. If it's mine..." Sophie narrowed her eyes, unsure whether to trust the stranger. There was something disarming about his tone, friendly yet oddly self-assured. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Fine, let's do it." They rolled the suitcase to a nearby bench. Sophie crouched to unzip it, fully expecting to find her clothes inside. But instead, there were neatly packed stacks of what looked like designer suits, leather-bound notebooks, and a pair of sunglasses far too expensive for her budget. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. "Oh," she muttered, quickly zipping it back up. "Definitely not mine." The man smirked, crossing his arms. "Told you." "I'm sorry," Sophie blurted, standing up. "I must have grabbed the wrong bag in a hurry. It looks so similar to mine." "No harm done," he replied smoothly, picking up the suitcase with ease. "But you should be more careful next time. Not everyone's as understanding as me." "Right," Sophie muttered, feeling both flustered and slightly irritated by his teasing tone. "Thanks for not making a big deal out of it." As she turned to leave, he called after her. "Hey, wait! Where's your bag? I can help you find it." Sophie hesitated, unsure why he cared. But as her eyes met his again, something about his offer seemed genuine. "Fine," she said. "It's a black suitcase, same size as yours. Let's hope it's not already halfway across the city." With a nod, he stepped beside her, dragging his own luggage while scanning the carousel for hers. She didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter was about to change her life forever. Sophie finally spotted her suitcase after another agonizing 5 minutes, lying on its side at the far end of the carousel. Nearly missed. She darted forward, grabbing it with a sigh of relief. "There it is," she said, tugging it off the belt. "Crisis averted." The man followed her, casually leaning against a nearby pillar as she dusted off the bag. "Glad to see it's safe," he said, that teasing smirk still lingering. "Though I have to say, you were pretty quick to fight for mine earlier." Sophie rolled her eyes, unable to stop a small laugh. "Well, if it had been mine, I'd have won that argument," he chuckled. "Fair enough, but I have to admit, you've got guts. Most people would have just apologized and walked off. You're persistent." She straightened up, narrowing her eyes at him. "Persistent or stubborn?" "Both," he said with a grin, extending a hand. "I'm Nathan, by the way." "Sophie," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. His grip was firm but warm, and she noticed for the first time how his casual demeanor somehow masked an air of quiet confidence. He didn't look like the kind of guy who'd get frazzled about anything, not even a luggage mix-up. "So, Sophie," Nathan said, slinging his bag over his shoulder, "what brings you back? Business or vacation?" "Vacation," she said, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I was visiting my sister. What about you?" "Business," he replied, the answer simple but somehow evasive. She tilted her head, curious. "What kind of business?" "Finance," he said with a casual shrug, clearly not interested in elaborating. "But it's nothing exciting. Definitely not as adventurous as vacationing with family." Trust me, Sophie replied with a laugh. Spending a week in my sister's tiny apartment isn't what I'd call adventurous. It's more like budgeting my sanity. Nathan laughed, the sound rich and easy. Sounds like you're good at making the best of things. I try, she said, shrugging. Anyway, thanks for offering to help earlier. You didn't have to do that. He waved it off. Not a big deal. Besides, it's not every day you run into someone who mistakes your bag for theirs. Makes for a good story, don't you think? Sophie shook her head, smiling despite herself. I guess so. Well, thanks again, Nathan. I should probably get going. Nathan hesitated for a moment, watching her as she adjusted the strap of her bag. Hey, he said, almost impulsively, if you're not in too much of a rush, how about a quick coffee? My flight got in early, and I've got time to kill before my ride shows up. She blinked, caught off guard by the offer. Coffee? Yeah, he said, his tone light but his eyes steady on hers. You know, that magical drink that keeps people functioning? It's on me. Consider it an apology for teasing you about the suitcase. Sophie hesitated, torn between politeness and curiosity. She didn't know this guy, but there was something about his relaxed demeanor that put her at ease. Finally, she nodded. Okay, sure, but only if you promise not to bring up the luggage thing again. Nathan grinned. Deal. As they walked toward the small cafe near the terminal, Sophie couldn't help but wonder why she'd agreed to sit down with a total stranger. What she didn't realize was that this one decision would lead to a series of events she'd never forget. The cafe was nestled in a quieter corner of the terminal, a welcome escape from the chaos of the airport. Sophie and Nathan found a small table by the window, where the faint hum of passing travelers blended with the sound of clinking cups and muted conversations. Sophie wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup Nathan had insisted on buying for her, unsure of why she felt so comfortable with someone she just met. So, she began, trying to steer the conversation away from awkward small talk. Do you travel a lot for work? Nathan leaned back in his chair, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness. More than I'd like to, he admitted. Airports and hotels start to feel the same after a while. What about you? Do you travel often? She shook her head. Not really, this trip was a splurge for me. I've been saving up for months, so it's not something I can do often. Nathan's brow lifted slightly as if impressed. Saving up, huh? Most people would just swipe a credit card and figure it out later. I guess I'm not most people, Sophie replied with a small smile. I like to keep things simple and debt-free, he chuckled. That's rare these days, but it suits you. Sophie tilted her head, curious. What does that mean? Nathan paused, studying her for a moment. I don't know, he said finally. You just seem real. Like you know who you are and what you want. It's refreshing. She blinked, taken aback by the unexpected compliment. I don't think anyone's ever put it that way before. Well, Nathan said with a small shrug, maybe they should. For a moment, the two sat in comfortable silence, the kind that felt natural rather than forced. Sophie glanced out the window, watching as planes taxied on the runway in the distance. You said your job's in finance, she said, breaking the quiet. That sounds complicated. Nathan laughed softly, shaking his head. It can be, but it's not as glamorous as it sounds. Lots of numbers, spreadsheets, and meetings. Not exactly edge-of-your-seat stuff. Still, it must be nice to have a job that lets you travel, Sophie said, sipping her coffee. It has its perks, Nathan admitted, but it also has its downsides, like spending more time in boardrooms than with people who actually matter. There was a trace of something in his voice, bitterness perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. Sophie studied him, realizing there was more to Nathan than he let on. That sounds lonely, she said softly. He glanced at her, surprised by her observation. Sometimes, he admitted after a pause, but you get used to it. Sophie frowned, her curiosity piqued. Do you, or do you just pretend to? Nathan's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Touché, he said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. Before Sophie could respond, her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of the moment. She glanced at the screen, a text from her friend reminding her of their plans later that evening. I should probably get going, she said reluctantly, standing and grabbing her bag. But thanks for the coffee, and for not holding the suitcase thing against me. Nathan stood as well, slipping his hands into his pockets. Anytime, he said, his smile more genuine this time. Maybe we'll run into each other again sometime. Maybe, Sophie replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. As she walked away, Nathan watched her go, a curious mix of intrigue and regret settling in his chest. He hadn't meant for this brief encounter to leave an impression, but somehow Sophie had. And as Sophie stepped outside into the crisp evening air, she found herself glancing back at the terminal, wondering why she felt like she'd just walked away from something she shouldn't have. You said, Sophie spent the next few days trying to push her brief encounter with Nathan out of her mind. Life was hectic. Her job at a local bookstore kept her on her feet, and evenings were spent sketching out plans for a small online shop she dreamed of starting one day. But every now and then, her thoughts drifted back to that stranger in the airport cafe, the way his calm demeanor seemed to mask something deeper. She didn't expect to see him again, so when she spotted him at the bookstore a week later, her breath hitched. Dressed in a tailored jacket and dark jeans, Nathan looked strikingly out of place among the rustic shelves and paperback stacks. "Nathan?" she blurted out, her surprise evident. He turned, and the familiar smirk spread across his face. "Sophie, small world." "What are you doing here?" she asked, still processing his unexpected presence. "I'm in town for work," he said casually, holding up a book. "Thought I'd drop by and pick something up. Didn't realize I'd run into my favorite luggage thief." She laughed, the tension easing. "You know, I'm never going to live that down, am I?" "Not a chance," he replied, his grin softening into something warmer. "Do you work here?" "Yeah," she said, glancing at the book in his hand. "It's not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills." Nathan studied her for a moment, a flicker of something unspoken in his gaze. "You like it?" "I do," Sophie admitted, "but it's just temporary. I've got bigger plans." "Like what?" She hesitated, unsure if she wanted to open up to someone she barely knew. But there was something about Nathan that made her feel safe. "I'm saving up to start my own business," she said finally. "Something small, but something that's mine." Nathan nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "That's ambitious. What kind of business?" "A little online shop for handmade items," she said, her cheeks flushing. "Jewelry, home decor, stuff like that. I've always loved creating things." "That sounds incredible," Nathan said, and the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "It's just a dream right now," she said quickly, brushing off the compliment. "There's still a long way to go." "Dreams have to start somewhere," Nathan replied, "and it sounds like you've got the determination to make it happen." Sophie smiled, feeling an unexpected sense of encouragement. But before she could respond, her coworker called her name from across the store, signaling that her break was over. "I should get back to work," she said, motioning toward the counter. Nathan nodded but didn't move. "Hey, Sophie," he called as she turned to leave. She paused, glancing back at him. "Yeah? Let me take you to dinner sometime," he said, his tone confident but not overbearing. "No strings, no pressure, just dinner." Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. But then she nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Okay. No luggage jokes, though." "Deal," Nathan said with a laugh. As she walked away, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Nathan again wasn't just a coincidence. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And as Nathan watched her disappear into the back of the store, he felt the same pull, a connection he hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. What neither of them knew was that this connection was about to lead to a revelation that would change everything. The dinner Nathan promised turned into something much more memorable than Sophie had anticipated. He had picked a cozy, unassuming bistro tucked away in the city's quieter streets, a place that felt intimate yet casual, much like Nathan himself. As they sat across from each other, sharing stories over candlelight, Sophie found herself opening up in a way she rarely did. She told him about her late parents, about how she'd struggled to make ends meet after they passed, and about how every small victory felt like a monumental achievement. Nathan listened intently, his gaze unwavering, and when he spoke, it was with a kind of understanding, that made Sophie feel seen. But despite how much they talked, there was still something about Nathan that felt guarded, like he was carefully choosing what parts of himself to reveal. "So, Nathan," Sophie said, leaning back in her chair as their meal wound down, "you've been dodging questions about your job since we met. What is it you really do?" He hesitated, his fingers grazing the edge of his wineglass. For a moment, Sophie thought he might brush off the question again, but then he sighed and met her gaze. "I run an investment firm," he said simply, her brow furrowed. "Like stocks and stuff?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Something like that." "That doesn't sound so bad," she said, sensing there was more to it. "It's not bad," Nathan admitted. "It's just complicated. People tend to see the money and make assumptions about who you are. It's hard to know who's genuine and who's not." Sophie tilted her head, studying him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you've been genuine with me since the beginning," Nathan said, his voice steady. "You didn't know who I was when we met, and you still don't care now. That's rare." Sophie blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "Wait, are you saying you're rich?" Nathan laughed softly, scratching the back of his neck. "I guess that's one way to put it." Her eyes widened as the realization sank in. "How rich?" He hesitated, then leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Let's just say I could probably buy this entire block if I wanted to." Sophie stared at him, her mind racing. She thought back to their first encounter at the airport, to his easygoing demeanor and the way he'd carried himself like an ordinary guy. "Why didn't you say anything before?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Because it doesn't matter," Nathan said simply. "At least, it doesn't matter to me. I wanted you to get to know me for who I am, not for what I have." Sophie sat back, trying to process everything. Part of her felt overwhelmed by the revelation, but another part of her couldn't help but respect his honesty. "So, what now?" she asked after a long pause. "That depends," Nathan said, his gaze steady. "Are you okay with who I really am?" Sophie thought about it, about the moments they'd shared and the person Nathan had shown her he was. Finally, she nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Yeah, I think I am. But you're still not getting out of those luggage jokes." Nathan laughed, the tension easing. "Fair enough." As they left the bistro that night, walking side by side through the quiet streets, Sophie realized that Nathan's wealth didn't intimidate her as much as she thought it might. It wasn't the money that defined him. It was the way he listened, the way he cared, and the way he made her feel like she mattered. But as comforting as that thought was, she couldn't help but wonder, could their connection survive the inevitable challenges that came with a life as extraordinary as Nathan's? Sophie's life didn't change overnight, but it certainly felt like it had shifted. Being with Nathan was easy. He was funny, kind, and far less complicated than she'd expected for someone with his lifestyle. But as much as she tried to treat him like any other guy, reminders of his wealth were hard to ignore. The first crack in their seemingly perfect connection appeared when Nathan casually mentioned attending a gala. "It's just a small event," he said over coffee one afternoon. "Networking, charity auction, that kind of thing. I'd like you to come with me." Sophie froze mid-sip. "A gala? Like with fancy dresses and important people?" Nathan chuckled. "It's not as intimidating as it sounds. You'll be fine." But Sophie wasn't so sure. She thought about her modest wardrobe, about how out of place she'd feel in a room full of people who'd never had to worry about rent or grocery bills. "I don't know, Nathan," she said hesitantly. "That's not really my scene." Nathan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "It doesn't have to be. You'll be with me, and that's all that matters." Despite his reassurance, the anxiety lingered. The night of the gala, Sophie stood in front of her mirror, fidgeting with the hem of the dress Nathan had insisted on buying for her. It was beautiful, simple, elegant, and far more expensive than anything she'd ever worn. But as she stared at her reflection, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong in his world. When they arrived at the event, the grandeur was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and waiters in tuxedos glided through the room with trays of champagne. Sophie clung to Nathan's arm, trying to ignore the curious stares of strangers as he introduced her to colleagues and acquaintances. "She's lovely," one woman said, her smile polite but clearly forced. "And what does she do?" "I work at a bookstore," Sophie replied, her voice steady despite the woman's raised eyebrows. Nathan immediately jumped in, his tone light but firm. "She's also an entrepreneur. She's working on starting her own business." Sophie glanced at him, surprised by how effortlessly he deflected the judgment. But as the night wore on, she couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The conversations were filled with jargon she didn't understand, the laughter too polished, the smiles too practiced. When they finally left the gala, Sophie exhaled in relief. "That was a lot," she admitted as they walked to the car. Nathan gave her a sympathetic smile. "I know it's not your comfort zone, but you handled it perfectly." "I felt like everyone was staring at me," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Like I didn't belong there." Nathan stopped, turning to face her. "Sophie, I don't care what those people think. I care about you, and you belong wherever you want to be." His words eased some of her doubt, but the night planted a seed of insecurity she couldn't entirely ignore. The real test of their relationship came weeks later when Sophie received an unexpected message. It was from a tabloid journalist asking her for a comment on her relationship with billionaire Nathan Reed. Her heart sank. She'd managed to keep her life private until now, but being with Nathan had put her in the spotlight without her even realizing it. She immediately showed Nathan the message, her anxiety spilling over. "Why is this happening?" she asked, pacing the room. "I didn't ask for this." Nathan looked genuinely upset. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I never wanted this for you." "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We ignore it," Nathan said firmly. "I'll handle it. You don't have to talk to anyone." But it wasn't that simple. Over the next few days, Sophie became hyper-aware of the way people looked at her. She avoided social media, knowing it would only make things worse. One evening, as they sat in Nathan's apartment, Sophie finally voiced the fear that had been building inside her. "What if I can't handle this?" Nathan reached for her hands, his expression serious. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." She looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't want to lose myself, Nathan. I don't want to become just someone in your world." "You're not just someone," Nathan said gently. "You're Sophie, the woman who stood up to me over a suitcase, the woman with dreams bigger than any of this. I fell for you because you're you, not because of where you fit in my life." His words calmed the storm inside her, and for the first time in days, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe they could make it work. Over time, they learned to navigate the challenges together. Nathan kept her grounded, reminding her that her worth wasn't tied to his world, and Sophie reminded him of the beauty and simplicity in living for moments rather than appearances. In the end, their story wasn't about wealth or status. It was about finding someone who made you better, who reminded you of who you were at your core. And as they sat together one quiet evening, watching the city lights flicker outside the window, Sophie realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because love, she realized, wasn't about fitting into someone's world. It was about building a new one together.